and happy to be here, except I got my butt kicked with something, and I'm feeling better now. So if my voice gives out, I'm going to just fade away and let Scott take over. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the willingness to do that, Scott. Thank you. And I just want to say that thing with NBC News, that this was 20 most impactful LGBTQ films of the year globally. And we were up with HBO and Pose and famous directors, and it was amazing. So I was really, really thrilled.
Film,
right. So,
Gloria, which is a great show. I mean,
yeah, it was.
Which I think is the most funniest thing on TV. But
right. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that. I'm having a little bit of an out-of-body experience because I'm in a room and I can hear my voice being projected out there. So it's like, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit, just to start. I normally start with 10 or 15 minutes of something, and I don't know if I'll go all the way today with that, but being New Year's Day, I think it's really important to talk about how we can misuse this whole concept of resolutions. And I think there's nothing more familiar to any addict than resolutions, and how we say, oh my God, I'll never do that again. Or we draw a line in the sand and then I'm never going to cross that line, or I'm going to cut back on this. And at least in my experience and every addict I know, it just doesn't last because we don't change anything else. So it's this really quick, easy pseudo commitment to change that really makes it not very effective in actually changing behavior. So I think this whole idea of resolutions is problematic, especially for addicts, because we are pros at resolutions, but it really doesn't translate into behavior change in an effective way. And with that, though, I want to propose an alternative, and that's a Zen concept called beginner's mind. And I think it's just so important, an approach to life. And the beginner's mind is simply approaching something with no expectations, with no preconceived notions, with no judgments in advance, and being kind of empty and open to the experience. And it's very much related to mindfulness, but it really simply is engaging all our senses and being present without saying, this is stupid, this is silly, this is not for me, whatever it may be. And I think anytime we're in a new situation, we are kind of forced into beginner's mind, for better or for worse. And I was talking to some of the guys that came in this week, some who have never had treatment before. And the experience of coming into treatment when you don't know, honestly, must be pretty terrifying. But anytime we're in an experience like that, we are acutely aware. We remember everything. We remember details. We're aware of tastes and smells and feelings, and it just comes at us in terms of being really, really present. And I think if we can kind of maintain that beginner's mind attitude of being present in our lives throughout the year, that really makes a difference. And what happens when we are not in a beginner's mind state is that we start to fall prey to limited belief systems that limit our thinking, to cognitive biases, mostly negative. Gee, this is never going to work out. Look at all the crap that's happened in my life. Whatever we tell ourselves, the little voice in our ear. So all those things can play a role in kind of perpetuating a very limited way of living. And in my mind, in recovery, beginner's mind, really and that's simply being open process. We have a saying that I'm sure our clients get sick of hearing in the group, but we say, trust the process. And that's what we have to do in this case. So I'd encourage everybody not to make a resolution this year, but to really look at how they approach life every day and every minute, and really be aware and use all your senses and really be present for yourself and for others. This webinar, of course, is mostly about addiction and sex addiction and porn. And if we translate it into that realm, a lot of times people have a lot of problems with intimacy, sex and intimacy both. And again, I think that marriages fall into this situation where they're out of balance and not in a beginner's mind space. We start to have assumptions about our partners. We start to have preconceived notions. We start to think, if I say this, then he or she is going to say that. And we kind of have this dialogue with ourselves that limits our ability for a real honest interaction. Or we're feeling shame and guilt and we're trying to compartmentalize and hide something that we don't want our partner to know about. And that takes a lot of energy as well. So that healing and integrity, I think, is just so important. But my bottom line message here, I guess, is to just really be present in a way that you're aware, and aware not only of stuff within you, but that gives you the opportunity to be aware of what's going on with people around you, including your partner, which is what the healing in sex addiction, at least, is all about. It's developing that empathy for people. And that really starts with awareness. And if we're locked up in these cognitive limiting beliefs and cognitive biases, we're not in touch with any of that. So I guess that's it in my feverish way. Talking about people's mind.
Thank you, David. There were a couple things that popped up for me. By the way, ask questions. I see we've already got one in the queue, which we'll get to in just a second. But ask us questions about anything, or about, resolutions versus the bigger picture. As you were talking, I was thinking, sex addiction is not about the sex. Alcoholism is not about the alcohol. Drug addiction is not about the drugs. It's about the bigger picture of how we live our lives. And recovery is not about just not drinking or not acting out or not using. It's about living a healthier, better life. And I had to reframe my recovery. I got into recovery in 2000, and my sobriety date's 2002. So, I just went from one addiction to another for 2 years. And I finally had to realize that it wasn't about controlling my consequences, and it wasn't about staying out of trouble, and it wasn't about, not being sick every morning when I woke up. It was about just generally being a healthier, happier, more connected person. And I think, 99% of the New Year's resolutions I hear are, are about one specific thing. I'm not going to do this, or I'm gonna go to the gym every day, or I'm not gonna eat, a pint of ice cream every night. It's so narrowly focused, or I'm gonna lose 20 pounds, which is what both of those usually relate to. And it's not about being a healthier, happier person. If I'm going to make a resolution, I want a resolution that says, I'm going to be happier this year. I'm going to be, more open, more accepting. It's going to be about how I live my life holistically, not just one little aspect of life. And that's one of the things I guess I've learned from, many years of recovery now. So great fun topic. So.
Yeah. I will just add to, I think the New Year's Day is a nice logical marker where we can sort of observe and kind of reset the clock a little bit, and it increases our awareness of new beginnings. But I think to fall into the trap of resolutions is tricky. I really like what you said about how do we have to reframe not just our addiction, but our recovery, and what that means. Yeah.
So we've got a question here. Q&A feature for question, or chat feature, either one. This question says, sometimes I find the environment of crystal meth anonymous meetings a little challenging. Often being surrounded by other users is tough. But I just had a party at my house today, and with a bunch of recovery people, and they all know I'm in sex addiction recovery. This was mostly AA people. But they said, one of them had a sponsee who had come to some Sex Addicts Anonymous meetings, and he was getting triggered. And he had gone to some CMA meetings and was getting triggered. So this came up just today. You're not the only one. So being surrounded by other users is tough. Also, the atmosphere can feel a little overwhelming. Would you recommend other places where one can get support or a sense of community, perhaps online peers or forums? Very good question. And I'm going to take this answer to the person here as well. So David, thoughts?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's something that comes up all the time. What we know about meth, it's a little different in terms of how it works in the brain. People become highly visually sensitive. People are easily triggered, more than even so in other drugs. And very similar, by the way, to porn and sex addiction. They all work really in the same part of the brain in much the same way, which is why we treat them all as one. Yeah, this is a common factor that I've seen with my clients, where they simply can be overwhelmed if I walk into a crystal meth anonymous meeting. I think my response is it really depends on where you are in the country. Um, it's sometimes the CMA meetings are new. There's not a lot of recovery in them. People struggle, and people have a hard time. Very often, though, especially in major urban areas, there are really meetings that have historical presence, guys with 10 and 15 and 20 years of recovery. And so I think it really almost is an individualized notion of who is at that meeting as opposed to what meeting it is. That said, I think I always recommend a newcomer to have a balanced diet of not just Crystal Meth Anonymous, but of other programs as well, AA or NA. And if there's a sexual issue in there, SA, not SA, but one of the S programs as well. And so I think that's something to be cognizant of. But it just depends on where you are. And I do know sometimes, I'm in Fort Lauderdale, we have big CMA meetings. The Friday night meeting tends to be kind of, everybody goes to the gym first and gets all pumped up and puts on their finest, their greatest outfit, and they're kind of on parade. And that really is not what we're going to a meeting for. And that can be extremely triggering for people. There's something in gay AA called roundups. We have one in Florida, we have one in LA, where some people find those extremely triggering too, just being around all these recovering guys, or men and women. And so I think part of the answer is to really increase our tolerance for stimulation like that, and not feeling like we're a slave to it and they have to react to it all the time without having some control. But also just use common sense. If there's a meeting that is just so triggering, for example, I had a client who I finally talked into getting a CMA. He went to CMA and he'd had sex with about 3/4 of the people in the room. Well, that's probably not a good place to start your meeting, because he was constantly triggered. And so it just really, I'd work with a sponsor, I'd work with a therapist to find an individual plan. I wouldn't rule out CMA necessarily. And I really believe CMA has an important role to play with this paired sex and drug addiction, because CMA is the one space where you can talk about drug use and sex and not get shut down. If I go to my AA meeting and start to talk about sexual behavior, they're going to say, well, this is a meeting about, drugs or alcohol. Sometimes they just say alcohol and don't even talk about drugs. And they don't want to hear about the sex. And so there's a really important place for that, I think, for CMA, but we just have to use kind of common sense. I was just looking to see if you used the word connection, but basically used all the other words that go with it. I think that's what we're really looking for. You talk about other places where one can get support or a sense of community, and that's exactly what we're looking for. And there's no magic place that has to happen, but I think there's a variety of programs, both 12-step fellowships and others, that give us that kind of support. What the biggest task I think we have in recovery is to expand our network of support in this kind of robust social network. That really is where the healing takes place. And the smaller our network is, the more threadbare it is, it can be a real problem.
Yeah, I think David just hit on it. The more different meetings you go to, the more chance you have to find one where you're going to get the support and connection and safety that you need. I know that crystal meth meetings can feel unsafe a lot of the time, but I also know, I live in a town with a lot of crystal meth recovery, and some of the meetings, I have a friend who has 15 years, and there are certain meetings he doesn't go to. He's like, no, I'm not going to that meeting. It's all, they're all meth sex addicts, and they're all hitting on each other, and they're all using together, and it's crazy. And there's no recovery in that room. So yeah, find another meeting. It sounds like you're from a major city, although I don't know. It looks like it's overseas. So I don't know how established CMA is there. But I would look into AA. AA is the granddaddy of the programs. Find a meeting where you can talk about drug use. I live in Palm Springs, California. We talk about drugs in our AA meetings. You go to LA, and some of the meetings you can, and some of the meetings you can't. But you just find one where you're comfortable, and yeah, if sex is part of the addiction, and I'm going to guess it is since you're in this webinar, Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous. You can usually talk about the pairing of drugs and sex pretty openly. Sexaholics Anonymous and SLAA tend to be less so. They tend to want to focus more on their specific issue. But and there's a lot of online stuff like this group here, where you can ask anything and get answers. And there's other support groups that are drop-in groups where you can interact with the guys in the group, and it's very much like a 12-step meeting, but it's moderated by a therapist, and they're really safe spaces. So explore everything that's out there, and find what's safe for you.
Right.
And the stuff that's not safe, don't go, because that's really counterproductive.
Right. Let me just do a shameless plug. Next Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, I'm going to start a chemsex group on a site called intherooms.com. And it's a 1-hour kind of discussion group of chemsex. It's not a 12-step meeting per se, but it's very much this format where people can bring up questions and talk about it and really develop community. So that's another option. There's more and more of things like that out there.
Yeah. Yeah, so keep at it and don't let other people discourage you. Remember why you're in recovery, and that'll help you. Next question here. Would you recommend a vision board to help bring about change?
Oh, I love vision boards.
Let me talk a little bit about what a vision board is real quick.
I will. So a vision board is taking a piece of paper or cardboard and taking images of things that we aspire to, or that we want, or that we want to be or become. It's aspirational. And putting those out on this board and just putting it in a prominent place where we can see it every day. And I have found that both of my clients and those times I've done it myself, it's really quite profound in that if we're just kind of not even focusing or meditating on that vision board, but we see it every day, what we know is that our mind kind of starts to work to bring those things about in a subconscious way. And so it sounds a little woo-woo, I know, but there's been some interesting science behind this as well, where we just lay out the visuals and we let the brain go to work without our conscious brain trying to make it happen, but allowing all the power of our brain, the other parts of our brain, to really help that develop. So I totally recommend that. I think it's a great idea. And I think everybody should do it from time to time as well. In the old days, we used to have magazines and cut things out of magazines. I assume I don't have that anymore. But now I think the higher tech way to do it is to print out images from the computer and glue them. But I would also say, by the way, just the way the brain works, you really need something that's real. It can't be a virtual vision board. I think it really has to be something you look at that's right there that you can almost touch. That's an important part of it. But yes, I highly recommend those.
Yeah, there was, God, I wish I could remember the name of the book. It came out about maybe 8 or 10 years ago, and it kind of talked about envisioning what you want and putting it out into the universe. And, I would always add, yeah, but, you still need to take some action, because my God doesn't slide hamburgers under my door. I have to I have to go to work every day if I want to eat. If I want something in my life to happen, I have to do it. If I want to become a medical doctor, I better apply to medical school. And then, because that's the first step. Or maybe, get an undergrad degree or whatever if I don't have one. So yeah, having a vision board is great. Having a plan that goes with the items on your vision board is even better.
Right. Right.
You got to take the first step. It's just like recovery. You've got to take the first step. Otherwise, it ain't going to happen.
And all of it comes down to action. What action steps are there to make it happen? Absolutely. Yeah.
But, having a vision board it's a wonderful thing, because it's a reminder. It's like affirmations that David and I both recommend, Post-it notes taped to your bathroom mirror, so that you see them. I am a good person. I am sober. I am living a better life. boom, boom, boom. That's a kind of a vision board for me. I see that every morning, when I'm brushing my teeth and shaving and not brushing my hair, but so.
Yeah, for sure. I would say too, for an addict, one of the confusing things I think, especially early recovery, is really not knowing what we want. We just kind of want the pain to stop and want our partners to not bother us or be quiet or be happy. And it's all kind of, a lot of the addict survival mechanism is to just kind of make the problem stop. And I think to really be able to take a breath and think, well, what do I really want? Do I want to keep doing this job that I may not like, or do I want to, live in this place as opposed to that place? Or how do I want to live? How do I want to be? And that process of asking ourselves those questions, I think, is really therapeutic, because it's something that addicts don't do. And I think it's something that we're not really in touch with very often. What do we want? What do we need? And so that just the very process of that is really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about people new to recovery not knowing what they want. I certainly didn't. I wanted I was having consequences, and I wanted them to stop. I didn't want to change my behavior. I didn't want to get sober. I didn't want to change my behavior. People, places, and things, I was just fine with them. I just wanted the consequences to stop, and that wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough. It goes back to what I talked about earlier. It's not about not doing the things that ruin my life. It's about living a better life in a bigger way. And until I reframed it that way, I could not get sober, and I had no real vision. And I mean, living a better life is pretty nebulous, but it was more of a direction that I had than staying out of trouble. And the consequences, by the way, did not go away. I had to live through all of them, but I stayed in recovery because I started living a better life.
Right. And I would say it's a truth that just wanting consequences to stop is not enough to fuel recovery and to form the foundation of a recovery program. That's not going to cut it. We have to have something bigger, something more aspirational, something more positive. Scott, you mentioned the affirmations that you and I both like so much. And we know in the construct of affirmations, if it has the word not in there or negative, that's not a good affirmation, because so I'm not going to smoke cigarettes. Okay, well, if I keep telling myself that, what am I doing? I'm constantly refocusing my brain on cigarettes, or I'm not going to have ice cream. Well, I'm thinking about ice cream all the time. So what we want to do is say, I want to live healthy and breathe fully, or something, just more positive and without that negative. And that has to do with what we're just saying with this. I want the consequences to stop. I'm not going to just to control the out of control behavior. That's just not enough to make it work.
So let's say we've got a sex addict who's new to treatment, because we've got the recovery guys on the webinar today. So I'll ask this question for them. And by the way, type in some questions, people, because we've answered the two we've received. So let's say a guy comes in and he's got a partner, a wife, partner, whatever, who's incredibly angry because he's been looking at porn for 4 hours every night after the wife or partner goes to bed, and their sex life is going to shit, and because he's more interested in looking at porn, some variation of the usual story, but for somebody who's in a relationship. And now the wife or partner is incredibly angry, and that has driven this individual into treatment more than anything else. It's probably not enough to recover long term, but it was enough to get that person into treatment. So what happens between the time that person walks in the door versus when he decides he needs to do it for himself rather than to stop the consequences?
That's a great question. And I think you're right. Usually people that come to us find their way to us after some sort of crisis, some discovery or some legal concern or an overdose or whatever it may be, that provides the opportunity for them to connect with us. And I think that certainly is an important piece of it. But what happens after that is, to me, the important part, the most important part. And that's those crises make us teachable. And that is I'd say it has a short shelf life. We can be teachable for those moments. And I think if we look back on our own addictive histories, I would have some terrible consequence. And, for a short period of time, I would be open to maybe finding some new way because there's such pain, such physical pain, such emotional pain. But then my addictive self would kind of get back in. But if we can get hold of somebody in those moments when they're open to some new ideas or when they're open to being teachable, that's when I think some big difference can make. And how does that look? It looks like someone being willing to fall into some kind of acceptance about their behavior and their role in the behavior, to have a willingness to look at it. It's all very first steppy stuff that we really have to take a look at. The crisis really is the impetus. It's the initial opportunity. But what happens after that? And those can be wasted. There were many wasted in my life before recovery finally took hold, where I just said, "Oh, that'll never happen again. Ooh, thank God." And I went off in my delusional way until it happened again. So I think to take it as a teachable moment, as a opportunity, that little window that's open only temporarily, and to get hold of some help and really move into it, it takes courage, and it takes, especially for a lot of the sex addicts, their partners are so angry or so hurt or so traumatized. The primary concern really is just making our partners feel better. And I think that's certainly important. But what our approach is that both the addict and the partner really have to start their recovery process almost individually. It's two different sets of concerns, and they occur at two different rates or paces. The partners often take much longer in terms of developing trust, to regain that, to work through the trauma. The sex addicts, at least, will say, I feel this is really different, and they believe it. And sometimes it is, but it takes a big, long program of recovery. So I think it's really taking that window of opportunity, but then doing something with it and finding a way to do it. And it doesn't have to be treatment. It can be, getting into, I didn't go to treatment, but going into 12-step meetings, and I went to 3 and 4 meetings a day. Right now, if I were getting sober today, I would go to treatment just because we know so much more, and I could have saved myself a lot of agony by fumbling around on my own. But it's taking that, stepping into that new space, and running for it, going for it with embracing that recovery piece.
Yeah, I think it's no coincidence that, whether it's in a treatment program or whether it's, in a 12-step program or some combination thereof, which tends to work best, I think. The initial work and the very first step, they're about breaking through our denial about our addiction. And when I was in my addiction, if anybody else had been engaging in the behaviors that I was engaging in and doing the amount of drugs that I was doing and drinking the amount of alcohol that I was drinking, I would have said, wow, that person has a huge problem. But it was okay for me because, and just fill in the blank of whatever popped into my head to make it okay that day. And step one is admitting we're powerless and our lives have become unmanageable. And in recovery, one of the first exercises that we do involves writing out your consequences and how your life got out of control. And I mean, it's just really trying to not waste the crisis, as David said. And I love the idea of wasting a crisis, just not learning anything from it. What a waste. We learn from our mistakes, and the initial work, in sexual recovery, it's a little bit different than AA and NA with step one, because we write out our step one, and then we usually read it aloud in a 12-step meeting. We give a list of our behaviors, we give a list of our consequences, we give a list of, you know, how we've hurt others, how we've hurt ourselves. I mean, you know, it can be pretty detailed, or it could be, you know, less detailed, but it's designed to, I mean, when I was in treatment, and I was in treatment for sex addiction, they had me write out a list of reasons why all of the things I was doing was okay. And then they made me read that aloud into the treatment group. And as I wrote out that list, it all made perfect sense. Well, it's okay for me to do this because. And then I read it aloud in the group, and I realized that I was completely out of control, insane, addicted. Oh my God. You know, and you know, and it still didn't get me sober. I needed to do some more experimenting, but yeah, it was a little crazy. So denial is powerful.
And there is something about revealing those aspects of ourselves, including our delusional thinking, in a group setting that is so powerful. And I found that it sounds like it could be shaming, but I found actually the opposite. I think it kind of drags it all out into the open. And I've never been in a meeting where that occurred, where people went running from the room screaming, you know, with their hair on fire. People sit there. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get somebody that says, gee, I did the same thing. And it's kind of tremendously healing to do that. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, one of the beautiful things about treatment programs and 12-step meetings is we're all there for the same reason. You know, we're all a mess, and we've all done everything. So we got a question here through our chat.
There's one in the chat too.
Yeah, I'm going to pull the one out of the chat feature.
Okay.
I have been in 12-step recovery for years, and I just enrolled in treatment. I am learning today that I wasn't ready when I first got into recovery. Now I'm scared that I won't be ready when I leave here. 3 to 5 years from now, I may go back out again. What do I do with that fear? Interesting question.
Yeah, great question. And not an uncommon scenario where people usually due to circumstances or imposed on them, get into recovery, but don't fully embrace it. And people can start to kind of skate along in 12-step meetings, but still not really internalize it to a deep degree or continue their behaviors while they're appearing to go to meetings. So this is a really important point, and you are not alone. There's a lot of people that are in this state. I think, to go back to something I said at the very beginning about beginner's mind, I think if you can toss out what you think you know and toss out your limiting beliefs and your cognitive biases and your willingness to control what people think of you or what they know about you, or to really tear down those compartmentalized parts of your life. And you know, the situation you describe, I don't think anybody can go through that without having all these compartments in their lives that are kept separate. You know, there's this group, our recovery group, but we have this behavior over here that really nobody knows about. And those have to be kind of wiped away so that we are living a clean, open, and simple life with integrity. And that's, but I think fear is actually a useful thing. You know, I've talked on this webinar before about fear being a really healthy, instinctive emotion that warns us about some situation we need to pay attention to, as opposed to anxiety, which is where fear gets kind of recycled in this kind of high sugar content, but no productive value emotion that's not so productive. So I would take that fear, and see what you can do to do things different. To me, to tie it back to the first step, I think it's all about letting go of control, and the control to do what you want to do, and no matter what. This is an opportunity. You know, we talked about never wasting a crisis. What a great opportunity for you, because you're in a good place. You are getting an open mind about this, and I think it's an opportunity to do something different. And so I would embrace it. I'm excited for you, actually. I think it's going to be exciting, and there could be a remarkable change.
Yeah, fear is a wonderful motivator for change, um, as long as it doesn't become anxiety. I always describe anxiety as living in the wreckage of my future. You know, just this constant fear of what might happen. That is not productive. The the knowledge that I could go back out tomorrow, if I'm not diligent about my recovery, that's a healthy fear, because I know what happens when I'm out there. It's not pretty. So that's a healthy fear. But you know, constantly living in terror that I might go out tomorrow is not going to do me any good.
Right.
It's going to drag me out tomorrow. Is what it's going to do.
Right.
So yeah, good point there about fear. Yes, anxiety, not so much.
Right.
Here's a question. My use of meth led to a collapse in what was once a good career. While I'm able to stay clean for relatively long periods between relapses, up to 12 months most recently, I've struggled with returning to my full-time career. I find it too stressful, and it led to a relapse. I've also tried easier, simpler careers, but these leave me feeling like I failed in life and I'm not living up to my potential, which also leads to relapse. Do you recommend an approach for addicts to return to work life?
Wow, there is a lot in there.
Yeah.
Before I get to that last question, I want to talk a little about meth and careers and what I call intensity. I think sometimes we see sex addicts, porn addicts, and certainly chemsex addicts, especially the meth users, are really intensity addicts. It's this need for stimulation. I was having a conversation the other day about it's very typical for someone to, for meth addicts to have high-powered jobs, you know, emergency room physicians, or to do bungee jumping or skydiving or rock climbing, or just to get that level of stimulation up. And we know just neurologically that meth kind of resets the reward circuitry of our brain so that we need more stimulation so as not to feel bored or depressed. It's not to even for the high, but just to not feel like crap. And so if you have a career that matches the feeling of meth in terms of intensity, that may be something you need to look at. That emergency room guy we spoke of needed to really reconsider, is that the job for me? Because it was, you know, dealing with one crisis after another, and a little hit of meth just seemed really the logical conclusion at the end of a shift. And so I think to really be aware of that need for intensity and how that relates to meth and some of the other drugs and sex and porn, for one thing. So that's one thing. I think we really have to be sensitive to what we do. And sometimes for sustained recovery, we are going to have to really look at how we spend our careers, because I think sometimes there is a mismatch. I don't think anybody's destined to have to change. I mean, the careers these days require a lot of investment of training and experience. And so it's not so easy to just throw it away. But I think it's something to really take into account and to really structure your job in a way that is satisfying but not overly stressful. That's going to be really important. And the conversation from the guys here about that, who's you know, typically said works 80, 100 hours a week. That's a really tough combination if you're going to start to stay in recovery. So that's one thing there. You said you've tried easier, simpler careers. These often left me feel like I've failed. And so what I'm hearing here is what therapists call a double bind. If I do this, then I'm screwed. If I do that, then I'm screwed. You know, we're kind of caught up in this trap of, well, my career is going to lead me to relapse on meth, but if I don't do that career, then I feel like a failure. And I would just encourage you to look at what we call cognitive errors, and that one I would classify as black and white thinking, which is making false choices. I either have to do this or I have to do that, and there's a whole lot of gray area in between those black and white thinking patterns. So I would encourage you to speak with your sponsor, speak with your recovery group, get feedback on this, take it out, because this is oftentimes, at least in my experience personally, this is really hard for me to figure out on my own, because I get trapped in my own thoughts and my own assumptions. And sometimes outside feedback is really helpful to sort of learn, how can I maneuver through this and stay clean and sober and have a satisfying career and do the things I want to do? You know, what do I have to maybe change? What do I have to give up? What can I keep? What approach do I need? So there's, I think, more options there than you might think. But I really admire your insight for that, the job connection, because that's one we see often with meth particularly. Now, finally, you said, do you recommend an approach for addicts to return to work life? I guess it depends on the work life. I think most addicts probably have a hard time, and I'm speaking myself too, with balance. You know, I tend to get involved in a project or get involved in something and kind of throw everything overboard and just focus on that for way too many hours. It may be a book, it may be an article, it may be a talk, it may be something with a documentary, but I just get it. And that gives me my intensity. That's my little rush of dopamine. But I'm playing with fire, because if I get too engaged in that need for stimulation and thrills based on this external stuff, I start to lose touch with myself, with my internal self. And I think that balance between taking care of me, taking care of my health, taking care of my diet, my sleep, and all that is something that we really have to strive for. I came out to LA to work because we have a high census. It was a last minute thing. I came out, and like the moment I got here, I got sick, and it's been killing me because I want to just kind of jump in and do stuff, but I had to kind of surrender, and I had my own little first step process about this. Just like, okay, I'm going to just close the door in my room and lie in my bed and in a stupor and try to get well. But I just really, every bone in my body wanted to kind of get out there and do. And sometimes that's not a good instinct. So I would really get feedback on this. Talk to your friends, talk to your sponsor, talk to your program people, and see how they handle these things. Because especially in meth recovery, the situations you've described are not unique. So there'll be a lot of people out there that have some good insight for you.
Yeah, and I just want to add that I feel your pain. I totally feel your pain. I have an incredible education, and I had a super high-powered job in my addiction, and I crashed and burned, and I took a job in retail when I started to get sober, and I felt like I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be seen at my job. I was embarrassed, and I kept that job for quite a while because all I could handle. It was pointed out to me by someone. He called it a McJob. And all I could handle at that point was a McJob. I needed a job where I showed up and I took money and made change. And when my shift was over, I went home and I didn't think about my McJob again until I had to go back in the morning. So I could focus on my recovery and focus on being a better person and living a better life. And, looking back, as much as I hated that job and as embarrassed as I was by it, I'm so grateful for it because I could pay the rent and not have to be, obsessed with, my work. I was able to do the recovery that I needed to do. But it was a really bitter pill for me to swallow, to take what felt like a real downgrade in life. And it wasn't. It was a real opportunity in life. And when I was ready, I started doing much more challenging work. And I love what I do now. And but I've learned to set some boundaries. So, when my day is over, my day is over. I turn the computer off and I don't look at it again until the morning, which I did not used to do. So yeah, I really feel your pain, and it's not a failure to slow down and recover.
Right.
It's an opportunity.
Right.
So yeah.
I just say one more thing about that, and I think it's important for every addict to look at the sources of our validation and what do we need to feel good about ourselves. And I think so often, not just addicts, but for everybody, but especially for addicts, we start to look for validation for things that are around us and connected to us, but not essentially us. So it may be a job, it may be an income, it may be a place we live, or the car we drive, or whatever else gives us some validation. But in the end, the validation we receive for that doesn't really seep through inside. If I'm still feeling less than, or if I'm still feeling that I somehow don't match up and I have to kind of overcompensate or work too hard or work more than anybody else to be okay. And in some extreme cases, I've had clients literally, when we got down to the belief system, I have to really work extra hard to kind of claim a place on this earth. It's just I don't have a right to be here, kind of thing. That's really unhealthy, and I think it's important for every addict to. And we're not going to escape that. We're human, but I think to at least nurture validation for inside. I really like it right now if somebody's will say to me, you have a good heart, or you're kind, or thank you for doing this or that. And that's what feeds me. The documentary, getting NBC News to say my little film was in the top 20. Hey, yes. Or to get an email from somebody in, a country overseas saying my book changed their life. That's what it's about. And so I think to really take a look at what gives us joy and what gives us meaning, and to really maybe revise that if we need to.
Yeah, and that's really what I had to do in my early recovery. I had to get my validation differently, and in what has turned out to be a much healthier way. I remember the first time somebody asked me to lead, a meeting, to speak in it, and I was like, "What, really?" And it made me feel good that they thought I had something to say that might help people. I remember the first time somebody said, "Hey, I'm going out of town. Would you mind dog sitting?" I was like, "You're trusting your baby with me? Do you know who I am? Do you know what I've done?" That was a shock to me, and it kind of somehow getting dopamine hits off of that was much better than getting dopamine hits off of, being the wonder kid at the office.
Yes.
Ultimately, that didn't mean anything to me. And, I'll tell you, when I was the wonder kid at the office, I had a party once and nobody wanted to come because I was really unpleasant. I had a party today and everybody came, and I had to shoo them out an hour and a half after the party was over because I had to do a webinar, and life is just so much better when I'm getting dopamine hits off of connection and something positive that involves other people than just me intensity, dopamine, big old rush, kind of crazy thing. But it takes a while to reset the brain and reset the thinking and to get to that point. And I think we see this, David, a lot because we have a lot of high-powered guys who come into our treatment center, doctors and lawyers and pilots and God knows what else. And, they kind of have to reset their thinking and realize when I went to treatment, I still had the higher powered job. And, I went back and the company was running just fine without me.
Right.
And that pissed me off. We have to reset our thinking sometimes.
Right. And to be, to gain a certain amount of humility. And I think sometimes we confuse humility with, and being humble with somehow a negative thing. And I think really it's just about being honest. It's about acknowledging not just our flaws, but our talents and gifts as well, not denying those as well. And so I think just having a realistic appraisal of ourselves. And I think the steps really help clarify that as we go through, by the way. But it's about really, again, the opportunity of a crisis. We can this is a moment to change how we think about ourselves and to change in a very meaningful way who we are and what we're about in the world. And that's exciting. That's what I find exciting about working in this field. I see it happening every day. And so, that's a little bit right there.
We talked a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, about acceptance and how that gets really confusing for a lot of people. There's a section in the AA Big Book that's mirrored in all the other literature about acceptance is the answer to all of our problems. And we talked about surrender, you know, surrender to win and all those paradoxes and how confusing that is. And, you know, basically, I think what we came down to was we're surrendering to the reality of our life. And to me, that's also what humility is. It's surrendering to the reality of our life. You know, I always thought I was way up here or way down there. I was either the greatest thing ever or the world's biggest piece of shit. Not just a piece of shit, the world's biggest piece of shit. And neither was true. And that was a tremendous lack of humility in both directions. And you know, I needed to surrender to the fact that, you know, I'm just a guy and I have some things that I'm good at and I have some things that I'm really not good at. And that's perfectly okay. You know, and I have an addiction and I need to deal with it. And that's okay. And maybe I'm not going to be president of the world. Fine.
And that's okay.
Do I want that job? I actually don't.
Yeah.
I did before. I thought I deserved it. You know,
yeah.
If everybody would have listened to me, you know, we wouldn't be in this mess. Well, we'd be in a worse mess, but that's a whole different story.
You know, Scott, you reminded me of one of the things we often remind people of, and that's because it's so confusing sometimes when you come in having done shitty things, frankly, with our partners and cheated and lied and sometimes for years. And sometimes people are so full of shame about that they have a hard time distinguishing the person that did that from who they are. And I think it's useful to just remind ourselves that, and this is a simplistic way to start, but I think it provides a way to distinguish that as, you know, I'm a good person who's done some bad things. And I think it's not just my whole life is, I'm not evil, I'm not, you know, this horrible, most horrible thing in the world. I have to take ownership of the things I've done, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the essence of who I am. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. And it starts to help people sort out dealing with some of the things they've done, yet still find themselves worthy of recovery. And I think that sometimes people get into that as well. Just, I'm such a piece of crap. I don't know if I deserve to get better, which of course has a lot of hint of victim mode in there. But I think it's really important to remember, you know, we're good people who've done some bad things and some really bad things sometimes, but to keep that in mind.
We are about out of time. So first of all, David, thank you for bearing up through a flu or whatever it is that's got you.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
We appreciate that. And thank you everybody for attending today on a holiday. We're glad you're here. We're sorry we were not available last week, but we're here and we'll be here every week for every Wednesday at 5 o'clock Pacific. David, do you want to wrap us up with a little bit about resolutions and things like that?
Yeah, just to try to avoid the trap of resolutions, these kind of quick and easy change ideas, and to really just be fully present in our life right here at this moment, and to try to sustain that with being aware of all our senses in the moment, taste, breath, sound, just to be anchored here in our lives right now. And if I can move through 2020 in that state as much as possible. Here.
We lost him right there at the end. He broke up on us right there at the end.
Oh, okay. I was just saying, if we can be mindful and use that beginner's mind concept all through the year, it'll be a great year, great 2020.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Thank you again, everybody. We'll see you next week. Happy New Year.
Thanks. Bye-bye.